Why does it feel like no one ever talks about Gen X? Seriously, scroll through social media, turn on the news, sit in any meeting about target audiences, and you'll see boomers making big decisions, millennials making big content, and Gen Z making big noises. But Gen X, they're just there, quietly holding everything together while getting almost zero attention. Some people call them the middle child of generations. And honestly, that tracks. Born somewhere between disco and dial up, Gen X grew up without the golden glow of post war optimism or the hyper connected glow of iPhones. Instead, they got dim hallways, cassette tapes, and a whole lot of figure it out. And maybe that's exactly what made them different. This video isn't a nostalgia trip. It's a dive into the psychology of a generation that's been holding up the ceiling without asking for credit. We're talking about the ones who were told, don't talk back, and still managed to learn how to lead teams, raise kids, and teach themselves how to fix printers. If you were born between the mid-60s and early 80s, there's a good chance you experienced something that today's psychologists call early adaptive independence. You might remember coming home from school, locking the door behind you, microwaving something weird, and watching cartoons alone. Back then, it wasn't called neglect. It was just Tuesday. Researchers like John Twenger and generational theorists like Strauss and Howe have pointed out how this latchkey kid upbringing wired Gen X to be hyper adaptable, practical, and just a little emotionally reserved. You didn't expect the world to hand you anything, and honestly, it usually didn't. While boomers were raised with group values and community institutions, and millennials grew up being told to chase dreams and change the world, Gen X was often told, keep it down and stay out of trouble. They didn't get a lot of attention, and they learned not to expect it. That's part of why they often feel left out of generational conversations. But it's also why they tend to step up quietly without needing a spotlight. Gen X grew up as the bridge between two completely different worlds. Theirs was the last generation to have a full analog childhood and the first to adapt to a fully digital adulthood. They played outside until dark, then became the first to use email at work. They wrote notes in class, then learned to text. They went from VHS to streaming without blinking. That tech adaptability, it's not just cool, it actually trains a flexible mind. And yet, you rarely hear them brag about it. This is also the generation that now makes up the quiet backbone of the workforce. They're managing departments, running households, and in many cases, caring for both their children and their aging parents. They are the sandwich generation, squeezed in every direction, but somehow still functioning. And maybe that's the thing. They're functioning, not always thriving, not always seen, but always moving forward. Steady, understated, reliable. There's a sort of grace in that, isn't there? But that same steadiness sometimes means they get skipped over. Brands ignore them. Platforms overlook them. Even social movements sometimes forget they exist. And you might wonder, does it bother them? Well, maybe. But if you ask, they'll probably just shrug and say, it's fine, because that's what they do. Gen X didn't grow up broadcasting feelings to the world. Mental health wasn't a household word yet. Most of them learned to process things privately, or not at all. It doesn't mean they don't feel deeply, they do. But they were trained to handle quietly, not share loudly. There's no single formula that defines a generation, of course, but patterns do exist. And Gen X's pattern is resilience built in silence. They didn't make a lot of noise, but they made the transition from rotary phones to smartphones. They adapted to hybrid jobs before remote work was cool. And many of them are now guiding the next generation without trying to be influencers. They just show up. That's what makes Gen X different. They don't need a parade, but maybe, just maybe, they deserve a little more recognition. What happens when an entire generation grows up not expecting to be seen? You get Gen X. They weren't raised to perform. They weren't handed motivational speeches or participation trophies. Most of them figured out how to navigate life in the spaces where no one was watching. And oddly enough, that may be exactly what built their quiet strength. Psychologists say that a child's early environment deeply shapes their emotional blueprint. Gen Xers raised during shifting norms, often grew up without the emotional scaffolding we now give kids. According to the American Psychological Association, many developed a kind of functional independence, handling stress by internalizing rather than externalizing. In plain English, if something went wrong, they didn't make a scene. They found duct tape and made it work. That doesn't mean they don't feel. It means they got very good at not showing it. There's an old saying, you can tell who the Gen Xers are because they never cry in public, but they're the first to help you move a couch. That's not a scientific definition, but it captures something true. Gen X tends to act rather than emote. They won't always tell you what they feel, but they'll make sure your car starts. One of the lesser known insights from generational psychology is that Gen X developed what researchers call high personal accountability bias. That's a fancy way of saying when something goes wrong, they often assume it's on them to fix it. Not the system, not fate, just them. That worldview can create admirable responsibility, but it can also lead to burnout, especially when it goes unrecognized. This also makes Gen X especially vulnerable to something ironic: invisibility fatigue. It's not that they want to be famous, most don't, but going decade after decade without being asked, hey, how are you really doing? That adds up. They're not bitter. They're just used to being self-sufficient to the point of invisibility. They became masters of emotional minimalism, not because they lack depth, but because they never expected an audience. And yet, in a world that sometimes rewards loudness over wisdom, there's something incredibly refreshing about their quiet clarity. This is the generation that changed careers without hashtags, learned new tech without tutorials, and raised whole families without sharing every moment online. They didn't post about balance, they just tried their best to live it. One fascinating insight from recent research is that Gen X tends to score high in practical intelligence. That is, knowing how to solve real world problems quickly, even without formal support. It's the kind of intelligence you don't notice until something breaks. And then you look around, and there's a Gen Xer with a toolbox, already halfway done. Their life experience straddles two eras, before and after the internet. That gives them a rare kind of lens. They understand both patience and pace, both analog memory and digital efficiency. In today's noisy world, that kind of dual perspective is underrated and incredibly valuable. And yet, many Gen Xers still carry an internal pressure, the feeling that they should just handle it no matter what. But here's the twist. That same quiet endurance has also made them surprisingly stable anchors in unpredictable times. In the workplace, they're often the ones translating across generations, helping to millennials navigate legacy systems, and Gen Z understand structure. At home, they're often the glue between parents and kids. In society, they're quietly keeping things from falling apart. They're not trying to disrupt everything. They're trying to hold it together long enough for someone to notice they were doing it all along. Maybe that's what makes Gen X truly different. They don't chase credit, but they deserve it. So if you're Gen X and you've ever felt like nobody noticed, maybe this is your little reminder. We see you. Your quiet strength matters. Your adaptability is rare. Your mix of logic, humor, and calm practicality is something younger generations are just now learning to appreciate. And if you're from another generation, maybe ask your Gen X friend or parent how they're holding up. You might be surprised what they say when someone finally asks. Because sometimes, being different isn't about making noise. It's about making impact. And Gen X has been doing that for years. Silently, steadily, and without asking for applause. If that's not power, I don't know what is. If this reminded you of someone, or maybe yourself, don't forget to subscribe. We've got more quietly powerful insights coming your way. And hey, if you're Gen X, leave a comment and tell us one survival trick you've learned. If you're not Gen X, tell us what you've learned from one. Let's give the most underrated generation a little space to speak. They've earned it.